Welcome everyone to Science Policy 101, specifically for our Space Physics and Aeronomy or Heliophysics community. Just a couple of ground rules before we get started here. And let's just dive into the roadmap for today. So I'm going to start off talking about heliophysics legislation. Then I'm going to talk about some congressional basics, then how to prepare to engage in policy, followed by how to start engaging. And then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So I'm going to start off talking about the difference between authorization versus appropriations legislation. But just to set the stage a little bit here, let's talk about the main agencies who set policy for the heliophysics. It's likely going to be the Department of Defense, specifically the research arm, the Department of Energy and their Office of Science, the NASA, NOAA, and finally NSF as well. So when I'm talking kind of about agencies and policy, I'm going to be referring to these agencies predominantly. So this is the very basic how a bill becomes a law. And really the things to remember is that all bills must be introduced in the House and Senate. You need a version of the bill in each chamber. Often those versions can be the same, sometimes they are not. Bills will then go to committees for consideration. This might include some information or kind of investigative hearings, or it might just go straight to markup or what we consider consideration, where maybe they adopt amendments or change change the bills in some ways. And members on the committee have the opportunity to do that. Once the bills pass out of committee, then they would go to the floor in each chamber. In the House, we are very much a majority rules, so kind of those 51 votes, if you will. And in the Senate, our threshold is going to be a little bit higher, where we need 60 votes or 3/5. In some limited cases, there might only be a simple majority needed to pass, but generally speaking, you need at least a 3/5 vote to prevent a filibuster. And then in order for the bill to become law, you either need to have passed the same exact version of the bill out of the House and the Senate, or the bill would go to what we call a conference committee. We actually don't necessarily see a lot of conference committees nowadays. A lot of times these negotiations happen between committee leadership in more back channels. I don't mean that in like a super spy kind of way, but just more that it tends to just be an ongoing negotiation between the committees, even before the bills pass out of their respective chambers. And then each chamber will have to go back and pass the exact same bill if they didn't originally do that. If there were differences that needed to be negotiated, that bill, that kind of compromise bill, would have to go back to both chambers to be passed before it can go to the president's desk. And then, of course, the president has the power to veto a bill, which again, we don't see necessarily a lot. And even rarer is then the bill goes back to Congress and they override that veto. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it does not happen a lot. And just to give you a sense of where we are, Congress has really slowed down its activity. Thus far this year, only 20 bills have been signed into law. And just also a point of kind of information here is although only 20 bills have been signed into law this year, I'm pretty sure if we were to combine both the bills that have been introduced in the House and Senate, I would guess at least 7,000, 8,000 bills have been introduced between the two chambers just since January. So it's a really small percentage of bills that kind of go through this process. So there are two main types of policy bills. There's authorization bills and there are appropriation bills. Authorization bills, traditionally, we've thought of them as the ones that set policy. So they establish, continue, or modify federal agencies, programs, or activities. And generally, we think of appropriations as being appropriations. They don't set policy, right? We've all heard the term policy writer. on an appropriations bill because appropriation bills are only supposed to allocate funding. But of course, funding is a very important policy decision. And also, too, we see all kinds of policy being set in appropriation bills. But these are the two main types of policy bills that normally we're talking about when we're talking about science policy in general. I will say a program can be authorized and not receive any appropriations. So if you're familiar with the program, the Advanced Research Proj Program Agency Energy, so like ARPA-E. ARPA-E was created and it didn't receive any funding to actually establish the office for several years. And then eventually it did start receiving actual appropriations. Also, sometimes we see authorizations expire and Congress will continue to appropriate money for the program. And occasionally we have also seen the Appropriations Committee try to effectively create programs. Some example or an example of this, or kind of do large scale change that should only be seen in an authorization bill. A good example of this is the National Institutes of Health. We've seen Republicans try to reorganize and reimagine what NIH looks like in appropriations legislation, which was not received well by a lot of people because it didn't go through the authorizing committee. So two kind of buckets here, authorization versus appropriations. We're going to talk about authorizations first, and then we'll talk about appropriations. So relevant authorization bills for this community. Obviously, there's the NASA Authorization Act, which sets policy for all of NASA. Some of you might remember the Pro-SWIFT Act, which basically created a national space weather strategy. It codified kind of an OSTP report. There's the America Competes Act, which some of you might remember from like 2013, but more recently in the past couple years, like around 2021 when it passed, they called it the Endless Frontiers Act, but it was essentially the America Competes Act. I think at the very end it was called the Science and Chips Act, but at its core it was actually the America Competes Act. And that authorizes NSF as well as a lot of STEM education programs, not at other agencies beyond NSF. So NOAA, unlike NASA, so the NASA Authorization Act, like the very first one, basically created NASA. And it said what NASA should do, what's kind of in their portfolio, what they should be prioritizing. And then that bill has been updated every couple years. And I feel like if you talk to committee folks, they're always working on a NASA authorization bill. So they're constantly thinking about this. NOAA does not have an organic act. NOAA was created through executive order, and certain programs have authorization bills, but NOAA itself does not have an organic act like NASA and many agencies. So there has been an effort to create a NOAA Organic Act, realizing that without an authorization, you can sometimes put yourself in jeopardy of being drastically changed kind of at the stroke of a pen, versus, if you have something written in law, it's a lot harder to do that. So NOAA Organic Act, which is, on the space weather front, relevant to this community. And then finally, the National Defense Authorization Act, which is known as the NDAA. So although authorizations, programs can exist um, without a current authorization, Congress considers the NDAA critical to passing every year. Even though they do not have to pass an NDAA every year, they consider it just as important as appropriations is passing every year. So every year they write a Department of Defense policy bill. And you'll hear that talked about a lot and, obviously very relevant to this community as well. So that's kind of authorizations in general. And now I'm going to start talking about appropriations. And this is appropriations in 5 simple steps. And I'm going to caveat this and say this is how it's supposed to work. This is not necessarily how it does work. So at the very beginning, the president is supposed to release his budget request. And key word there is really request. It's really a statement of his priorities. There's a day in February, I think it's like the first Monday in February. There is a specific date by which he's supposed to introduce it. A lot of times presidents miss that deadline. Definitely new presidents, when they're first sworn into office, often miss that deadline. I think we have seen the president's budget request as late as April and May. I will say for this past fiscal year, for some parts of the federal government, we never saw a president's budget request. But really, the president's budget request is what really initiates this whole process traditionally. And then the Senate and the House should each pass a budget resolution. And note here that it's a budget resolution, and resolutions don't become law. They're more a statement of priority for each chamber. And then Congress should pass a combined budget resolution. And all that budget resolution does and why it's important is because it basically sets the budget for the Appropriations Committee. It tells the Appropriations Committee how much money they have to spend. And then the appropriations would kind of take their allocations. There are 12 appropriations committees in both chambers, and they would draft up their legislation. And then ideally, they would pass those bills on the floor. Then they would work out any differences between the two chambers' versions. And they would send those to the president then, those kind of compromise versions for him to sign into law. This process has not worked this well in years. I think, as many of us know, a continuing resolution has become an annual tradition where we see potentially more than one continuing resolution. So I just want to take a note here, take a pause here to dive a little bit deeper into budgets. I think sometimes it can be really confusing when you hear people talking about appropriations, spending, funding, budgets. But I just want to differentiate that budgets and appropriations really fall into two different camps. The president's budget request typically does start the appropriations process, although not always. Um, I would say when the president is of one party and Congress, the majority in Congress is also of the same party, often they will wait for the president's budget requests, and kind of give deference to him. But sometimes we've seen, let's say we have a Republican president and a Democratic House, we might see the House just move forward with their process before the president has even released his budget request, especially if he's really late. Um, you know, with the assumption that the president's budget request is not going to, be released too late, but basically they won't show him the same deference as they would as someone of the same party. And a think of the budget as just like your own personal budget. It's going to include both revenue, kind of what are you bringing in terms of income, and then what are you spending. The president's budget request for each agency is developed in coordination with the agencies themselves through the Office of Management and Budget in a series of negotiations, which we call passbacks. And this normally happens, I would say late summer, fall is normally when they're wrapping up that process, or when they should be wrapping up that process, I would say. And it's also important to note that even when the president's budget, I think we often hear this phrase that they're considered dead on arrival. That doesn't mean that some of those policy ideas won't trickle down into appropriation bills. Even if the numbers, even if they get a very bad reception on Capitol Hill, that doesn't mean the ideas and the policies we won't see those again in appropriation bills. We often will, because really this is the president's opportunity to lay out his ideas, especially if they have initiatives, right? Like AI, and we see that's like a very across the government thing, right? We'll see in the president's budget request how they want AI to be rolled out, or where they see how they want to prioritize things in their president's budget request, because, they don't necessarily get a chance to initiate a lot of legislation. And then finally, budgets are policy documents and they do not become law. So I mentioned on the previous slide that they are resolutions. Resolutions are not laws. And you noticed before that although in the previous slide, although the House and Senate ideally pass the same budget resolution, that never goes to the president's desk. They are not laws. They are really, think of them as prioritization or policy documents. So I always like to kind of just orient ourselves when we're talking about appropriations, what's the bucket of money we're even talking about? So for appropriations, notice this kind of purple bluish, the part that's really big, that's all mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is traditionally set by a formula. So you can see here, there's Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, right? Those things are set by formulas about who's eligible to receive them and how much money you're going to receive. And those are set by authorization committees. Discretionary, and you'll see it's this teal color, I would say, and about half is non-defense, half is defense. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about appropriations. So in many ways, appropriations is a very small part of the pie when we talk about federal spending. And then, of course, you see net interest. But just to give you a sense of kind of orientation, we think of appropriations as being one of the most powerful committees, and in many ways it is, but in many ways, authorizing committees are really spending much more money than the appropriations committee is. So break that down even further. Um, and let me just say, so discretionary spending, think of that as kind of an equal sign to appropriations. This is a breakdown of, and again, this is all from fiscal year 24. This is all from the Congressional Budget Office's website, and this is the most recent year they have information for. So you'll notice, and I put it in a big red circle. It's a little hard to see on here, but just to give you a sense of out of $1.8 trillion in appropriation spending, how much spending goes to science, space, and technology. So really, we are a pretty small part of the pie here. And just to get, but there is a big, there's a nice chunk there for natural resources and environment, and of course, health. But just to give you a sense of where funding is going. And also you'll notice for defense, they have about 138 for their research, development, test, and evaluation line. And I think sometimes, people want to know why we don't go after more defense spending. But in part, some of that is basic research, but a lot of that is very applied research. And I think traditionally, defense is also just not an agency that AGU has done a lot of work in terms of advocating for or working on, I'll say. So, a couple of things to remember about appropriations. This is how the vast majority of federal Earth and Space Science agencies receive their funding. Congress has the power of the purse. It's truly a president's budget request, but at the end of the day, it is up to Congress to pass spending bills. And they are the ones who really, truly have the power. Um, in the Senate and the House, it is called the Appropriations Committee. They are the exact same 12 subcommittees, and each subcommittee is responsible for one bill. It is the only must-pass legislation that Congress deals with. And then, just if you didn't know, the fiscal year runs from October 1 to September 30th. So just to give you a sense of both what the committees are and where we are. So this is the status for this year's appropriation bills. You can see in the Senate, they did not even manage to pass all of their bills out of the committee, although the House did. And then we've only seen 3 bills on the floor in each chamber. Um, there is talk of them combining 3 bills. I believe they're agriculture, Milcon, VA, and maybe the legislative branch. They're talking about bringing up 3 of these bills for a vote soon, in what they're calling a minibus, but we'll see. For this community, when you're targeting appropriation committees, the 3 in red are the 3 that you would want to target. So within commerce, justice, and science, within commerce, that's where NOAA lies. And then the science piece includes both NASA as well as NSF. For the Department of Defense, obviously the Department of Defense. And then for energy and water, obviously the Department of Energy that's the subcommittee for Department of Energy. So when you're thinking about talking to appropriators or talking to appropriations committee staff, these are really the 3 subcommittees to target. So possible appropriations outcomes. in the green, that's the ideal, right? All 12 bills signed into law by the 30th of September. If that does not happen, one, we could get a government shutdown, which is what we're in right now. We could also have a partial government shutdown if they were able to pass some appropriation bills and get those signed into law, but not all. We've seen that in the past where some agencies have a shutdown, but other agencies are still operating. We might get a continuing resolution, which I mentioned briefly before. I like to think of a continuing resolution as a band-aid. Basically, what they say is whatever is in law currently, we'll just extend it until a certain date. The problem with a continuing resolution is that agencies can't start or stop anything they're currently doing. And I would say, especially for large scale projects, this makes it really hard, especially if, like in this current fiscal environment, likely a lot of agencies are going to see a cut this year. And so you have agencies planning at their most conservative levels because they're not sure what their final appropriations for the year is going to be. But it could also be the case that, you're going to see a 10% increase, but you're still acting very conservative, um, because you don't know, the appropriations discussion is not over. And then that sometimes leaves agencies in a position where, late next summer, they're trying to get potentially billions of dollars out the door very quickly, because they've kind of run out of time to spend the money. Traditionally, in appropriation bills, agencies have the year to spend the money, unless they're normally not allowed to carry over a lot of money. Often what we get is an omnibus, and an omnibus is basically where they take, I would say, at least two of those appropriation bills and package them together. So sometimes I mentioned before that sometimes if it's a very small amount of bills, they call it a minibus, with a minibus being, two or three or four bills. But it basically just means we've packaged multiple appropriation bills together. And then we have also seen what they call a cromnibus. And a cromnibus is where they are unable to reach an agreement on certain appropriation bills. And so they put those agencies under continuing resolution. And the agencies that they are able to pass appropriation bills, they pass, in which case you kind of end up with a combination of a continuing resolution and an omnibus, which we call a cromnibus. And these are kind of this possible scenarios, I would say, even for this year. So we've already seen a government shutdown and a continuing resolution, and we'll see, how Congress passes bills at the end, well, when they return, and how they kind of deal with fiscal year 26 and wrap up that whole process. So what about reconciliation? I would say this has been a bigger thing in the past couple years than it's generally been throughout history. The thing to remember about budget reconciliation is it enables Congress. This is only Reconciliation is a very partisan process. No matter which party does it, it's very partisan. And it's only something you can do when the president and both chambers of Congress are held by the same party. So it's not always an option. And because it's very partisan, it allows in the Senate for them to overcome the filibuster, which basically means it allows them to do things on only a simple majority versus a 3/5 60 vote majority. And reconciliation is really about that mandatory spending, debt limit, certain tax issues. So it is definitely related to appropriations, but it's actually more targeting that bigger half of the circle, um, that I showed you earlier, where mandatory spending was in purple, and you could see kind of how large of a chunk of federal spending that was. And so, although we've seen a lot of reconciliation in the past couple years, it's actually not that common. Again, it's targeting mandatory spending and also, kind of how we do taxes. And there are a lot of rules surrounding it. And also, it has to be tied to a budget resolution. So Congress actually only gets so many chances, right? There's only one budget resolution for each year So they only have so many chances to use this tool because it has to be tied to a budget resolution. It's not um, it's not a limitless tool, if you will. Um, so it's related, but it's kind of I will say for science funding, unless I think it has more impact, I would say, on the kind of environmental climate side than it necessarily does on the space side. Although, as we saw this year, they did use reconciliation to find funding for NASA, but traditionally we've seen it more impact, um, I would say, like natural resources, climate, world, and the way they do things. So, with that was a little background on process, and now I'm just going to talk about kind of just basic setup of a congressional office. So, changing gears, pretty 180 here. So, a typical congressional office, if you've never met with a congressional office, underneath the member of Congress, you're going to have the chief of staff. And then we're going to kind of have these two camps. We're going to have DC staff and district staff. And someone really important to know in a congressional office is the scheduler. They might go by different titles, but basically they're the scheduler and they handle the member of Congress's calendar. So if you're ever trying to meet with a member of Congress, they can be a really powerful ally, and it's good to know who they are. Then you're going to have communication staff, and then you're going to have legislative staff. And legislative staff often consist of a legislative director who oversees the member of Congress's legislative portfolio. You're likely then going to have legislative assistants who handle specific issues within the policy portfolio. You might have legislative aides who help more senior staff. You're also likely going to have what they call LCs, or legislative correspondents. And what they do is every time you write a member of Congress, they're the ones who respond to you. And so they're responsible for all of the mail that the congressional office gets and kind of responding to the mail. And like legislative aides, legislative correspondents tend to be, more junior staff. And then you're going to have district staff. And most of the staff in the district office are going to be all about constituent services. So helping people, making sure they're getting their benefits, whether that's veterans or Social Security or even passport, or if there are local issues, um, they might be the one to come out to kind of big events in the community, basically. They are also going to be the ones when the member of Congress is in the district, they're going to be generally be the ones who accompany the member of Congress wherever they go. I would say the one exception is you'll see a lot of DC staff in the district during August recess as well. And generally, most congressional offices will tell you that most legislative business is handled in DC, and constituent services is predominantly the role of the district staff. But I want to caveat everything I just said with this first statement, which is every congressional office is different. Sometimes people might have different titles. We met with Bernie Sanders' office the other day, and their head of science lives in the district. So every congressional office is different. These are just some general guidelines. Typically, you will definitely see a smaller size staff in the House. You'll also have smaller offices in the House. And House staff, because they are smaller in size, they will handle more policy issues. I heard someone say the other day 20 policy issues. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you will definitely see them handle, I think 8 to 10 different policy issues. And when I say policy issues, I mean like they might be the science staffer, the immigration staffer, the education staffer, the women's rights staffer. Um, then in the Senate, I think it's more typical to see people handling like 4 or 5 different issues. I would say Senate staff tends to be a little bit older, and maybe have a little bit more expertise as well, although again, that is not always the case. Whatever committees your member of Congress sits on, they will have really developed some expertise in that area. Members of Congress often pick their committees based on both district interest and personal interest. So For example, if you have a military base in your district, likely you want to sit on, maybe Veterans Affairs, or maybe you want to sit on Armed Services, but likely you'll want to sit on a relevant committee. On the House Science Committee, a lot of members who sit on that committee have some kind of big NASA science, or not NASA, but some kind of big science facilities in their district. Thinking about commerce, I think a lot of people on commerce have DOE national labs in their district. So a lot of times you'll see kind of that like district connection with how members choose their committee assignments, but also sometimes it's just more what they did previously. I feel like I worked for a member of Congress who was a doctor, and he really wanted to sit on energy and commerce because that's the committee that oversees health issues. So you'll see a lot of that intersection too, kind of what was their previous life, so to speak. Typically, representatives are going to sit on 1 to 3 committees. And with senators, senators actually have the ability to sit on almost as many committees as they want. I'll say typically you see them sit on like 3 to 5 committees, um, just kind of depending. I will say in both chambers, there are what they call kind of A and B and C committees. And a lot of times members of Congress, if you get on an A committee, your choices for B and C committees are limited, especially in the House. For example, for a lot of representatives in the House, if they sit on the Appropriations Committee, you likely don't see them sitting on a lot of other committees because that's definitely an A committee. So, just kind of wrapping up talking about committees here, the most relevant committees for you all, I would imagine, are Appropriations, Armed Services, which handles the National Defense Authorization Act, which we talked about. And then in the House, it's the Science, Space, and Technology Committee that handles all research at any agency. So they definitely have jurisdiction over NSF, NASA, DOE Office of Science specifically, although not necessarily all of DOE. They have jurisdiction over like NIST, also OSTP. But you'll also notice that the jurisdictions aren't perfect. So there are parts of NOAA, like fisheries, for example, that are actually dealt with through the House Natural Resources Committee. And I mentioned before the Pro-SWIFT Act, and the Pro-SWIFT Act actually, I think, went to Homeland Security as like its first committee of jurisdiction. So this is not like a perfect example, but just to give you a sense. And then in the Senate, the committees are pretty much the same, except it's going to be the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee when we're talking about NASA, NSF, NOAA in terms of jurisdiction, as well as DOE Office of Science. So just kind of further giving you some policy insider knowledge, congressional calendar. So this is the congressional calendar for this year. So we're in the first session of the 119th Congress. So the yellow highlighted days are when Congress is supposed to be in DC. Due to the government shutdown, Congress has kind of been calling out. Mike Johnson has been canceling kind of their trips to DC basically since we started or since the beginning of October. So highlighted days are in session days. And just to give you a little bit more insight, so looking at, I'm going to pick the week of January 6th up there. So that first day on January 6th is what we call the fly-in day, and members of Congress have to report generally around 6 p.m. when they'll do, that's when the first votes will be. And then likely they would fly out that Thursday, which is the 9th. And we call that the flyout day, which, they typically leave around noon. This is really the time when they're in session to meet with legislators, especially if you want to meet with them in person. You can meet with staff at any point throughout this period. The DC staff will always be there, but the yellow days are when the member of Congress is going to be there. Also, these yellow days are the most busiest days on Capitol Hill, especially in the lead up to, or during appropriations season. But also too, if you're hoping to meet with a member of Congress, one other note here, looking at that week of January 6th, your best bets would be the 7th and the 8th. Because on the 6th, they're arriving too late, and on the 9th, they're probably leaving too early. But remember, those are also the days they're going to have committee meetings. So their schedule is never great. But if you want to meet specifically with the member of Congress, really your options are those kind of 2 days in the middle when they're fully in DC for the whole day. So district work period or recess days, this is when the members are in the district working and connecting with constituents. But often these fall over holidays, which is an important thing to keep in mind. And also often that members of Congress can also be traveling during this time. So for instance, um, there are a bunch of members of Congress going to COP this week because next week was going to be a recess week. So there are a bunch of members going to COP, or you might see them going to Davos or meetings like that. And also, they just might be doing other traveling to kind of learn about policy issues or challenges, things like that. But if you want to meet with your legislators in the district, this is the time. So we all know, or many of us know, about August recess when they're kind of in the district the entire month. Next year, it's an election year, so the recess periods will be longer and there will be more of them. Specifically, October will also be a recess month, although obviously a lot more election work is going to be happening then. So, which members of Congress do you meet with? Who do members of Congress want to hear from? First and foremost, members of Congress want to hear from constituents, voters. But they also want to hear from those who contribute to the district. So those could be residents. So maybe, you're a foreign national, but, you teach at the University of Iowa and you've been there, you know, you have no plans of leaving, or maybe you're a grad student there, or maybe, you know, you could just be a grad student actually from anywhere in the US. Um, but your hometown is somewhere else. But so if you live in the district, definitely your the member of Congress will want to hear from you. So people who are employed in a district, so let's say you live in you live in DC, but you work in Maryland, it's definitely worth it to go meet with the Maryland representatives as, let's say, an employee of Goddard. Um, and also, too, I will say they always want to hear from people who employ people in the district as well. You see this not necessarily in our world, but more with like big corporations or even AGU itself, right? Every time I go meet with an office, I talk about how many members we have who live or work in the district or live and work in the state. What about committees, though? I would say committees are interested in hearing from subject matter experts, especially if it's relevant to something they are working on or should know about. I would say, AGU works really hard, and I think kind of as a collective, it's good to have a relationship with committee staff. And I'm talking not about personal office staff now, but committee staff themselves. But I would say a lot of times, committee staff, because they don't have to meet with anybody, they do tend to be a lot choosier about who they meet with. And you probably have a better shot of talking to committee, either kind of joining collectively as a group. I worked with the Heliophysics Coalition earlier this year to do some committee meetings, or if you work with a group like AGU. Just like as a note about committees, because they don't technically have to meet with anyone because they have no constituents. So I kind of, now that we've done a little basics, I want to talk about preparing to engage in policy because this is a really important part of it. It is really just a special form of science communication. And I really want you to be thoughtful about how you engage with policymakers if you want to be effective. Successful communication of science is really a prerequisite for successful use of science in policy, just as a blanket statement. And, you know, I like to say this all the time. It's a conversation, not a presentation. So this is likely going to be different from a lot of the things that you do when you engage with policymakers at any level. And also, too, that, it's about building trust, which is a very big part of it, especially if you're trying to bridge that divide between where your policymakers are and where you would like to see them be. And then just a fun cartoon to kind of really hit this point home. Our former colleague liked to say this was a real experience she had, so don't let this be you. So, when you're thinking about engaging, these are just some basic steps. We could go a lot deeper. Like this in itself, this part of the presentation could be a whole hour presentation, but just to give you guys some basics on this. Research and know your audience. Really have an understanding of on the specific issue that you're talking to your legislator about. Are they a champion? Are they neutral on it? Or, are they really opposed to it? Because generally speaking, when you are working with your legislators, you really want to show them that I'm not asking you to care about something new. I'm showing you that this is something that you care about, you just didn't know it already. Like this is just an extension of things that you're already working about and that you already care about. Like I'm never asking you to do anything new. I'm just kind of broadening your horizons because you just didn't know. Um, and so really know your audience because that's the only way you can kind of make that point to them. So we're going to research, know our audience. We're going to develop our ask and message concisely. You might be asking yourself, what does that mean? Basically, your ask is, what do you want? And then your message is going to be, why do you want it, right? Like, what is your skin in the game? Why do you want this? And why should they want it too? Definitely coordinate with others if possible. You want to demonstrate that there's a community that cares about this. It's not just me, Joe Blow, who cares about this. There's a whole group of people who care about this issue. I'm not an outlier. And then also remember, policy change happens slowly with repeated engagement. That relationship piece is so important. And also because bills on average take 7 years to pass. Also, I mentioned, we have passed 20 bills this year into law, but thousands have been introduced. So obviously, the time scale of change, specifically through passage of legislation, can be really slow. And also stay informed is a good, to kind of keep yourself on the pulse of the things that are happening. Science policy sites and newsletters. AGU has a monthly newsletter we call Science Policy Alerts, but a lot of the science societies have great science policy information that they're always like putting out. So AGU, AAS, AAAS, the Planetary Society. A great newsletter that I like to read if you're looking for some of those deep dives, but also like more educational opportunities. The American Institute of Physics has an FYI newsletter. It generally comes out every Monday afternoon, and that's a great one. They also, like AAAS, have a pretty good federal budget tracker. Subscribe to your legislators' newsletters, especially if you want to know about those in-district events, but also to get a sense of what they care about. Because if they're talking about it, they probably care about it, as well as following them on social media. If any of you are on Blue Sky or Twitter or even LinkedIn, I think once you start following people who are in the science policy world on these platforms, that's a great way to stay engaged and learn about issues, but also opportunities. And then there, of course, are a number of great space and policy blogs. I know I'm on NASA Watch all the time or Space Policy Online. Those can be really great outlets to just stay involved and kind of stay up to date. But I'll really make a plug for the society stuff because that way you know for a fact that you kind of don't miss anything, if you will. So how to start engaging. And actually, let me go back. I'll just tell you, work with the community. Policy is really hard. It often requires, it's not just talking to one legislator, it's talking to a lot of legislators in both chambers, at lots of different times. So work with a community. There are kind of no lone rangers in science policy, if you will. Um, but if you want to, like the first step, right, what kind of direct contact can you make with legislators? You can obviously send them emails, you can make phone calls, you can post on social media. But again, all of these things are most effectual when multiple people are doing them, right? So it's like your legislator got 10 emails about this, or they saw 10 people, tagging them in a post about this issue that's come up. That's definitely more effective, um, than you just, tagging your legislator in a post, unless you're, maybe if you're like the dean of your university, then that's really, maybe all it takes is one phone call or one email, but likely it's going to take a lot. And of course, you're going to need to do this with multiple legislators because generally you need well, no, always you need multiple legislators to do anything. Um, Meet with legislators and their staff. I always encourage everyone to do that, and I'm going to double down on that in the next slide. But you can also attend town halls or other district events. Um, and they sometimes also do teletown halls. I know I worked for a California member, so getting back to the district was always harder. So we also did like teletown halls as well to kind of stay connected. Um, and district events, most members of Congress or their staff, I should say, a lot of them have like where they do office hours at libraries or coffee shops in the district. And that can be a really great place to get to know district staff, but also, and I say you get to know district staff so that when the member is in town, you've kind of already built a relationship with the office. And so it increases your odds of having a face-to-face meeting with the actual member of Congress when they come to the district. You can also do lab or site visits. I will tell you, everyone loves a field trip, including members of Congress, but also don't forget about congressional staff. Congressional staff have a lot of power. Um, and so kind of getting them on your side and on board, and kind of then, you have an advocate to the member of Congress in the office itself. And that can be really powerful. But everyone loves to see something kind of hands-on or honestly, just something cool. But also too, members of Congress are themselves also influenced by their constituents as well as the media. So you can do things like public talks, but you could end your public talk with what we call a call to action, right? Like something like, this is why it's so important to fund heliophysics, or this is why we need the next generation of heliophysicists. You can always talk to the media and kind of build a relationship with members of the media who are writing and talking about your issues. And also op-eds or letters to the editor. We've had a lot of, AGU has had a lot of success with this year. Um, with people really writing about their experiences and why kind of these, I want to say cuts to science, but also harms to science also harm the community. And that can be really important. I think we have to talk to more than just each other. It's really important that we're also talking to all of our friends and family and neighbors so that they know why what we do is so important, because that often feels like the missing piece. And I will say policy is still a face-to-face business, and visiting your policymakers in person matters. But also too, once you do that, all of these other ways to engage are so much easier. So I really encourage you to take advantage of meeting with your legislators and their staff, either here in DC or back at home in the district. And it's really, really about relationships. I like to tell people, right, if a stranger walked up to you, had a 30-minute meeting with you and tried to convince you to change your mind, you're unlikely to do that based on that one conversation. But, if it's someone you see every day or you talk to often enough, there is real possibility for change there. And I think this is a good story too, especially if you're like a grad student or something. The scientists who influenced the most weren't necessarily the most famous, but those they connected with on a personal level by engaging consistently over time. Um, and, scientists familiar with legislative assistance and correspondence can become trusted resources. So again, it's really about those relationships. It's not necessarily about, scientific prestige or expertise, if you will. I also, because it's a relationship, right? A relationship should be a little bit of a back and forth. I want you to consider what you can offer offices. Maybe that's information. Something we've heard repeatedly this year is that a lot of members of Congress don't know what's happening on the ground. There's a lot of policies rolling out from the administration, but they have no idea what the impact on the ground is. And so getting stories from constituent scientists or students has been super helpful. So, you can offer information about challenges, but also successes. If your institution or you yourself get a big grant, members of Congress always love to show off that, federal dollars are going to their district, or that new discoveries have been made in their district, or that scientists from their district publish papers that are in the New York Times. They like that kind of stuff. But you could also be a bridge to other experts. Maybe you don't know about this one specific thing, but I guarantee you, you probably have a better science kind of network than they do. Or it might even just be another community member. This is a lot of what AGU does when we get asked for, hey, we're having a hearing on an issue. Who do you think? Or is there an expert who works on this issue that you can refer us to? And sometimes it's to be a witness, but sometimes it's more we're exploring this issue and we need to talk to a bunch of people. Help us find who to talk to. And again, I talked kind of about this already, but just insight into how things work or are implemented. Sometimes members of Congress are writing legislation, but they don't actually, perhaps they've never been a PhD student. So they don't know they don't know what the impact of the legislation would actually be for a PhD student or on a PhD program. And so kind of sharing information on how things work, like what would this look like in practice, can be really helpful. But also kind of opportunities, right? Like maybe you have legislative ideas. Maybe there's a challenge out there that you think legislation could solve. Um, Field trips, right? Like I mentioned this before about inviting them to their lab, or just like the opportunity to meet with a lot of constituents. We had someone one time organize a roundtable with students for their member of Congress, which they really appreciated because it gave them the time to connect with a lot of constituents at once. But also press opportunities, right? If there's something big coming up that you know about, perhaps you can invite them to it. Members of Congress, they like their name to be in the press. It generally works out well for them. And again, just want to emphasize that this is something we have to do together. This is not a, one person endeavor. We're definitely more powerful together. And so I mentioned communities before. What are the communities? Obviously, AGU, AAS, Planetary Society. But luckily, your section has an advocacy committee, and Brian is the chair, although Emily organized this. And they have a website. I'm sure they are always looking for takers. And then some of you might also be aware there is a Heliophysics coalition run by Ian and Gordon Emsley, who many of you likely know. And I would say we all kind of worked together. So there's, it's not maybe not a perfect circle, but definitely a lot of overlapping circles here. And what are the kinds of things that we're doing? I would say we're doing a lot of information sharing amongst each other, but also trainings like this, and just kind of briefings. Ann and Gordon both do a lot of briefings for the community about kind of what's going on. I would say timely campaigns. So if something like an issue has emerged, all three of us, I've seen us kind of activate, whether that's writing letters or doing meetings or calls, or thinking about a well-placed op-ed. So when, something is happening, and then also, of course, congressional visits days. Um, yeah, please use these resources, always get the low-hanging fruit first. And then I'll also mention AGU has a current campaign now about saving Goddard facilities. A lot of you might heard the news that they've started closing down buildings. They want to close 13 buildings at Goddard. And although some of this was scheduled, they weren't scheduled to close for about another decade. So we're really concerned about this. So if you click on this link, or maybe if I can ask Sam to drop the link in the chat, it's a write-in campaign. and you can write your legislators about this issue. I think one of the best defenses we've had is kind of raising the raising the status of issues under this administration. We can't necessarily fix a lot of things, unfortunately. We can make sure that these issues, that people know about these issues and that they kind of don't go under the radar. And that is all I have. And I'm happy to take questions from everyone. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides so I can see all of you. Thanks, Sam. I'm gonna check out the questions in the chat. I know Emily has been answering some of them. Also, please feel free to raise your hand or just come off mute. Um,
Hi, my name is Asti Bhatt. I'm sorry, I couldn't find the raise hands button, but is it okay for me to ask question?
of course.
Um, I am at SRI International as a space physicist, and I'm the PI of NSF supported AMISER facilities in Alaska and Northern Canada. Um, I'm just wondering, how do you create an AGU campaign? Right now, what I wanted to bring up to this community and to all of you is NSF's NSF supported facilities, ground-based facilities, are also facing huge challenges, and NSF is not able to support A, or the president's budget request doesn't allow them to support B. These community facilities, which are there to provide data to the broader science community. So how do you go about creating, and for example, if you wanted AGU support to do this, how do you go about it?
Yeah. Honestly, so I handle NSF for AGU. Email me. I will say we are really drinking from the fire hose right now. So more than ever, I do not know everything that's going on, especially because what we're kind of seeing in paper and then like what we're seeing in practice, I think is like very far apart right now. So email me some details and I'll likely follow up with you. Um, because I will say, like, I think a big reason we took on the Goddard thing is because there've been some really great reporting about it that's been really shocking. Also, at this moment, it's really hard for us to talk to agencies, um, especially because I think so many of our agency folks are so vulnerable that like we also don't want to endanger anyone's job. But yeah, email me with the details and I will follow up. Also, I sit on the steering committee for our NSF coalition, so just want to see like if other people are also doing something, and just kind of collecting information as well.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Yeah. And I saw you had a question about who decides how the money to various agencies is distributed. Um, It is a bit of the appropriations committee, but I will say specifically for NSF, the community has fought pretty hard that like within, for example, like the geosciences directorate, that's all kind of peer review driven and kind of science driven as opposed to kind of decided by Congress. But it's kind of a mix of that.
But so, for example, NSF has multiple divisions, directorates. There's atmospheric and geospace science, there's mathematical and physical science, etc. How do they get appropriate money? Is that from Appropriations Committee that says, well, AGS should get X amount and MPS should get Y amount?
Yeah, so specifically for NSF, the level appropriations is just actually above that. So NSF, the line item is research and related activities, which funds all the directors except for the education and human resources one, although they're trying to move that into that bigger bucket. And so each directorate does not actually get specified funding by Congress. That's decided by NSF, and where they think the kind of the science, basically the peer review kind of the peer review process decides how much money each directorate gets. Sometimes we will see specific call outs like $30 million for harmful algal blooms, for instance. But generally speaking, within NSF, like the community fought pretty hard for that to be an NSF science-driven process.
Thank you.
Brittany, could you just give like a quick recap of the times of year roughly that are most effective for people to like get involved?
Yeah. So appropriations, I would say, has just become a year-long process, right? We are still fighting for fiscal year 26 funding, despite the fact that we are in November. And so after the government reopens, there will be a window of time to kind of push Congress to actually finish the appropriations process, but also um, at those Senate level funding levels, which especially for NASA, the heliophysics allocation is much, much better than it is in the House. Um, so there will be that window of time. But I would say if you're talking about weighing in on fiscal year 27, um, really, I would say like starting at the end of January, definitely watch to see when the president's budget request comes out because that is still a good indicator of like, oh, we need to be doing stuff now. But I would always say sooner rather than later. It's always better to have what you want in the initial draft of legislation than it is to try to do it through like an amendment or trying to be getting them to do whatever you want at like the later stages. That is always much harder. But I would say traditionally February is a good time to start. Um, and but also to just try to be strategic because you can definitely meet with your members of Congress. I would say max probably 4 times for the year. So maybe if were trying to meet with them or engage with them quarterly, um, but that means you really need to be strategic about when you meet with them. But earlier is always better. So let's say you meet with them, but appropriations doesn't actually come up until April and you met with them in February. Well, in April, make sure you follow up with them, and it's really going to be on you to follow up with them. But I would also say, even if you can't participate in an AGU or AAS Congressional Visits Day, kind of pay attention to when they're doing things. Because I work with them a lot, I know AAS, the Planetary Society, and AGU, we're all doing fly-ins in like March, April, May. So that springtime is a good time because normally we're starting to see bills actually already written by the time we get to like June and late May. Anything else I need to cover, Emily, or you'd like to, Brian?
You did a great
Brittany, this
job.
has been fantastic. Thank you so much. I think there's been a
Yeah,
lot of great questions and a lot going on in the chat, so it's good to see people engaged.
yeah, thank you.
Okay.
You covered everything, I think. And please, seriously, people ask questions like this is the time to do it. There's no
Yeah.
such thing as a stupid question.
Also, too, I mean, I like to tell people there's like no book I can give you about how to do science policy. You just start engaging. So much of this is about norms and relationships. And then, one of my favorite things also to say about policy is like everything's sacred until it's not. I think Trump has definitely shown that, right? Like lots of things that we thought could never happen can happen. So happy to talk through scenarios as well. Yes, we can share the recording and the slides.
If no one has any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Thanks, Sam.